When the most powerful military in the world stops bombing a country and the country being bombed calls it a victory, and Washington doesn't quite deny it, something has shifted. Not tactically, not temporarily. The United States has agreed to pause its strikes on Iran for 2 weeks. Tehran has announced it as a triumph. Trump has called it progress toward a long-term peace deal. Both cannot be entirely right, but both might be. Here's where we are. After roughly 5 weeks of sustained U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, strikes that killed the supreme leader, degraded air defenses, and hit military infrastructure across the country, Washington has suspended its bombing operations. The stated reason is a framework for negotiations. The stated time frame is 2 weeks. Iran's Supreme National Security Council has described it in language that is, diplomatically speaking, the opposite of conciliatory, a forced retreat. They claim their forces and their regional allies inflicted historic damage on American positions. They've pointed to a 10-point proposal they say they delivered to Washington, and which, they claim, formed the basis of this pause. Iran's foreign minister has confirmed that the Strait of Hormuz will be open to safe passage for the duration of the 2 weeks, coordinated directly with Iranian armed forces and with, his words, due consideration of technical limitations. From the American side, Trump described it as a workable framework. He said the U.S. has met and exceeded its military objectives and is very far along with a definitive agreement. Those two statements, from two governments, describe the same 2 weeks in ways that are almost entirely incompatible. That is the story. Let's start with the mechanics of how a ceasefire gets sold, because this one is being sold very differently depending on which capital you're sitting in. Tehran's framing is maximalist and deliberate. The Supreme National Security Council did not use the language of mutual de-escalation. It did not describe this as a joint humanitarian pause or a confidence-building measure or any of the other diplomatic euphemisms that get deployed when neither side wants to admit it, blinked. It used the language of battlefield victory. We inflicted historic blows. The opposing side has retreated. The Iranians are not interested in presenting this as a negotiated tie. They are presenting it as a forced concession, extracted through military pressure. Washington's framing, by contrast, is aspirational and vague. Trump's statement contains claims that are simultaneously optimistic and unverifiable, that military objectives have been met, that a definitive agreement is close, that peace in the Middle East is imminent. These are things a government says when it wants to move forward without appearing to step back. They are also, notably, claims that do not contradict Iran's version of events so much as they ignore it. Tehran says it forced a halt. Washington says the halt is part of a process it controls. Both framings exist in parallel, largely unchallenged by either side's domestic media, which is precisely the point. This narrative divergence matters not just as a communications exercise but as a strategic reality. In modern conflict, particularly asymmetric conflict between a superpower and a mid-sized state, the domestic perception of victory is often as operationally significant as anything happening on the battlefield. Iran needs its population to believe the state held. The Islamic Republic faced serious internal pressure before this war, from the protest movement, from economic dysfunction, from generational disaffection. 5 weeks of American bombing, as counterintuitive as it sounds, gave the government a nationalist consolidation it could not have engineered any other way. We saw this pattern in Serbia in 1999, in Iraq repeatedly, in virtually every case where a foreign bombing campaign hit a state with any degree of functional cohesion. The bombs land, and the critics go quiet. Now, with a ceasefire Tehran can frame as a victory, that consolidation is compounded. The government didn't just survive. According to its own messaging, it prevailed. Whether that claim is operationally accurate is almost beside the point domestically. The story is in place, and once the story is in place, it tends to persist. The American narrative is under far more pressure, and not primarily from Iran's messaging. It is under pressure from the arithmetic. The New York Times reported that 13 U.S. military bases across the Gulf region are all but uninhabitable following sustained Iranian missile and drone attacks. American troops were relocated to Qatari hotels. The Al Udeid Air Base sustained severe damage. The Wall Street Journal confirmed that U.S. bombers are now being launched from bases in the UK, Germany, Portugal, Italy, France, and Greece, which means, functionally, that Iran has denied the United States its forward operating infrastructure in the Gulf. The region that American military posture was designed to dominate is now a place American forces have retreated from. Against that backdrop, Trump's claim that military objectives have been met is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The original stated goals, elimination of Iran's nuclear program, destruction of its missile capabilities, and the implied but unstated aspiration of regime change, have demonstrably not been achieved. Iran still has a functioning government. Its missile inventory has been degraded but not exhausted. 5,000-plus attacks were launched in the first month alone. And its nuclear program, whatever damage the strikes inflicted on declared facilities, exists in a doctrine and an institutional culture that cannot be bombed out of existence. The ceasefire does not settle the narrative war. It intensifies it. Because what happens in the next 2 weeks will determine which framing history reaches for when it looks back at this moment. The most important detail in the ceasefire announcement is not the bombing pause. It is the qualifier attached to the Hormuz announcement. Safe passage through the strait will be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. Read that sentence slowly. Safe passage. Not free passage, not unconditional passage, not the resumption of normal maritime operations under international law. Safe passage, via coordination with Iran's armed forces. This is Tehran saying in bureaucratic language, "We are choosing to let you through." That choice is revocable. The coordination requirement means Iran retains operational control over who transits and when. The technical limitations clause gives it a face-saving exit ramp if it decides to tighten things again. This is not a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. It is a 2-week lease. The landlord is Tehran. Why does that distinction matter? Because it means the core leverage Iran has accumulated, the thing that turned a regional military conflict into a global economic event, is still intact. Approximately 20 million barrels of oil transit Hormuz every day, roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Qatar, all dependent on it for their exports. China gets a third of its oil through it. Japan gets nearly all of its Middle Eastern supply through it. When that corridor is controlled rather than open, the price of oil doesn't merely rise, the architecture of global energy security comes into question. Iran has not surrendered that control. It has suspended its exercise of it for 2 weeks, explicitly framed as a conditional act linked to the continuation of negotiations. The moment the U.S. resumes strikes, or the moment negotiations break down beyond recovery, the strait goes back to being a choke point under Iranian management. This gives Tehran something extremely valuable in any negotiation, a credible, time-limited threat that it has already demonstrated it is willing and able to execute. The ceasefire framework, viewed from this angle, is less about peace and more about verification. Iran needs to see whether Washington is genuinely negotiating or playing for time. Washington needs to see whether Tehran's 10-point proposal contains anything workable. Both sides are using the 2 weeks instrumentally, not sentimentally. There is something else worth noting about the Hormuz arrangement that has received almost no attention in Western coverage. When Iran ran its selective blockade over the past weeks, allowing Pakistan's tankers through, Malaysia's, China's, in some cases apparently collecting fees denominated in Chinese yuan, it was not simply exercising military leverage, it was piloting an alternative system, a world in which passage through the most critical maritime choke point in global oil trade requires coordination with Iranian authorities and is settled in non-dollar currency, is a world in which a significant pillar of American economic architecture, reserve currency status, sanction power, cheap sovereign borrowing, is structurally weakened. The 2-week pause suspends that pilot program but does not erase the data. The data is, the pilot worked. China's tankers moved. Yuan changed hands. Ships passed. The infrastructure for an alternative to dollar-denominated energy trade was tested under live conditions and held. Whatever the diplomatic outcome of the next fortnight, that demonstration cannot be undemonstrated. Saudi Arabia, which officially ended its exclusive dollar commitment to oil pricing in mid-2024 and has built the technical plumbing for yuan settlement through its currency swap with Beijing, is watching this data accumulate with an attention that no public statement from Riyadh will ever fully capture. The strait is on loan. The economic lesson it teaches is permanent. 2 scenarios dominate the next 2 weeks, and the distance between them is considerable. In the first, negotiations produce a workable agreement, something resembling the 10-point Iranian proposal, adjusted for American domestic political requirements. Iran's nuclear program is subject to some form of verification and constraint. Sanctions are partially lifted. Hormuz returns to full, unrestricted operation. Trump claims the victory of having achieved through deals what Obama achieved through the JCPOA, a framework, however imperfect, that keeps Iran non-nuclear and the region somewhat stable. This is presented to the American public as the art of the deal. Iran presents it to its own public as proof that resistance works. In the second, the talks collapse. Iran reads the 2 weeks as a stalling tactic, or Washington gets spooked by domestic political pressures and reinitiates strikes, or Israel, which has its own objectives in this conflict and does not require American permission to act within its own doctrine, takes an action that Iran treats as a breach of the ceasefire. The strait closes again. Brent spikes. The world economy, already absorbing 5 weeks of disruption to fertilizer supply chains and shipping insurance, takes another structural hit. The most underweighted variable in almost all Western analysis is the position of the Gulf monarchies. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain built their entire security architecture on the assumption of American military dominance in the region, on the belief that if Iran ever moved against their interests decisively, Washington would respond with overwhelming force and prevail. That assumption has been tested publicly and found to be contingent. Iran demonstrated it could effectively deny U.S. forces their forward positions, control the region's most critical waterway, and negotiate terms with a superpower from a position of leverage. The Gulf states watch this happen. Whatever security guarantee Washington extends to Riyadh or Abu Dhabi in the aftermath, it is a guarantee that has been stress-tested in front of the entire world and found to carry conditions. That changes the calculus for hedge betting toward Beijing. Not immediately, not with fanfare. But the directional shift, which was already underway before February 28th, has now received the most persuasive possible evidence that it is rational. The final thing worth watching. Iran said explicitly that its hands remain on the trigger. That is not boilerplate. It is a calibrated signal to Washington, to its own population, and to every regional actor drawing conclusions from this pause. The gun is still loaded. The ceasefire is a choice. Choices can be reversed. Let me put this plainly. This ceasefire is not a peace. It is a structured interval, long enough to determine whether both sides have enough to work with, short enough that neither side has to fully commit to the story they're telling their own public. Iran has handled this conflict strategically, with a patience and coherence that was underestimated almost everywhere in Western commentary. It did not need to defeat the United States militarily. It needed to make the military campaign too expensive, too diplomatically costly, and too economically disruptive to sustain without something to show for it. 5 weeks in, with American troops in hotel rooms and China preparing to mediate, that calculation has proved correct. The Trump administration wanted a quick cinematic victory, one that could be packaged for domestic consumption with the same energy as a tariff announcement or a summit photo. What it got was a war with a logic of its own, being run by an adversary that has been planning for this scenario for 30 years. Empires rarely lose because they run out of weapons. They lose because they run out of patience. And patience, in this particular conflict, has never been the American side's strongest suit. 2 weeks. Watch what the Strait does and watch what Riyadh says. Two governments describing the same 2 weeks in incompatible terms. That tension doesn't resolve until the 2 weeks are up. And maybe not even then. The Strait of Hormuz, as I said, is on loan. The economic lessons from this conflict are already baked in. We'll be tracking how this develops. If you found this useful, like and subscribe. There's more to come on this. Stay sharp.